During the Second World War, an entire generation recorded their personal experiences for posterity. Combat cameramen braved enemy fire to send home moving images, many of them in color. They captured history, and in the process they captured ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, bearing witness to the color of war. World War II was the first mechanized war, with men in tanks and other armored vehicles pounding across a lethal modern battlefield. But the very importance of these machines to the new tactics of combat also made them magnets for enemy fire. Riding into battle in a claustrophobic steel shell, these men were forced to confront a whole range of weapons and tactics that were specifically devised to destroy them and their machines. They also had to overcome the challenges of hostile climate, brutal terrain, and the mechanical breakdowns of their own vehicles. For the tank crews, this turned the war into a harrowing struggle for survival, one that they faced in every theater around the globe. The Second World War depended on technology like no other conflict in history. It changed the nature of battle forever, making mechanized forces the backbone around which any army is built. The United States alone constructed over 3,200,000 military vehicles during the war. By 1945, there was one vehicle for every 4 men. This revolution was the result of a new wave of military thinking, which occurred in the 1920s and 30s. For thousands of years, armies depended upon foot-borne infantry supported by horse-mounted cavalry. This age-old method of warfare now began to give way to the increasing use of armored machines such as half-tracks, armored cars, and tanks. Covered by hardened steel armor plates to protect their occupants from enemy fire, some of these vehicles could carry up to 20 or more fully armed soldiers into battle. They also mounted weapons ranging from machine guns to heavy cannon, providing a potent offensive punch. Given these unique qualities, many pre-war strategists envisioned the new mechanized forces filling the traditional role of the cavalry, launching massed hell-for-leather charges at the enemy.
Armor is a weapon of opportunity. Through its great speed, firepower, and flexibility of maneuver, it is capable of surprising the enemy and attacking him before he is capable of defense. Continuous action against the flanks and rear so confuses the enemy that he becomes easy prey for the remainder of the army.
But the actual battlefield employment of mechanized forces was often far different from what theorists predicted and what many historians have recorded. Indeed, the conditions faced by the men who served on and in the machines of war were not appreciably better than those who went into battle the old-fashioned way, on foot. At first, however, many of the men who joined the new mechanized formations saw only the advantages.
At the time, I had no idea what an armored infantry regiment was. But I figured out that it was a new type, in which you rode instead of walked most of the time. I said I would like that.
After a day of training, the mounted troops had to scrub down their mounts, clean and polish saddles, bridles, scabbard, boots, and all other leather gear before they could go to evening mess. We only had to wash our truck, and that took much less time.
The main striking force of an armored unit was its tanks. These tracked behemoths were designed to be the ultimate armored weapon, the king of the modern battlefield. The crews who manned them came from every corner of America. To many, they were the armored cavalry, or tankmen. They referred to themselves simply as tankers. Some of these men, including Corporal Jim Rotshadle, were reluctant to serve in the relatively new machines.
An officer came by one day and started talking to me. "I'd like to have you in my tank," he said, "as my gunner." You can't tell an officer to go to hell. I said, "I'd rather not, really." He didn't say much. He left, and then he came back another time and said, "Well, that's the way it's going to be. You're going to be my gunner." I didn't want to be inside of a tank. Have you ever been inside of a tank? It's claustrophobic when you're locked in there. I couldn't say no, so I became his gunner, and that's where I stayed.
Being a tanker meant adapting to harsh battlefield conditions in a series of imperfect machines. In America, tank development following World War I had been severely hindered due to a shrinking military budget. But after the German Blitzkrieg in France in 1940, during which tanks were extensively used with devastating results, the U.S. Army redoubled its efforts to develop a new family of tanks to counter the impressive German vehicles. They fell into two main groups. Light tanks, such as the M3 and M5 Stuart, were relatively small and built for speed, to fill the need for armed reconnaissance and swift strikes at the enemy's flanks. Mounting a 37mm cannon and up to 3 machine guns, the Stuart weighed 14 tons, carried a crew of 4, and could reach speeds of up to 36 miles an hour. The backbone of U.S. mechanized forces was the medium tank. Larger and more heavily armed than light tanks, medium tanks were meant to bear the brunt of armored combat, either in support of infantry units or operating in independent formations. The main U.S. medium tank to see combat in World War II was the M4 Sherman. Between 1942 and 1946, American factories produced over 49,000 of them. The Sherman weighed in at 32 tons and was armed with a 75mm main gun, later upgraded to a higher velocity 76mm gun, which had greater penetrating power than the earlier weapon. A fully armed Sherman carried 97 rounds of either high explosive or armor-piercing shells and was protected by 2.5 inches of frontal armor. A .30 caliber bow-mounted machine gun was used for close combat situations. Depending on the model, it had a top speed of 24 to 30 miles an hour. 5 men comprised a Sherman crew. The tank commander sat or stood in the turret. In the turret itself was the gunner, who aimed and fired the main gun and the gun's loader. In the front of the vehicle sat the driver and the assistant driver, who also manned the bow-mounted machine gun. Each position came with its own hazards.
I felt sorry for my loader. He was sitting in a position, and the breech on these 75 cannons is a huge breech. The shells were about 2 feet long, and when you fired, it went back almost to the back of the turret. It was a hell of a position.
Visibility for all tank crews was extremely limited. Their view of the outside world was restricted to the bits and pieces glimpsed through a few periscopes and narrow slits in the turret and hull. One Allied tank driver described the difficulty of trying to see in and from his tank during a battle.
With every round fired, clouds of dust obscure the driving compartment. The roar of the tank's engine is drowned by louder noises, so that its behavior had to be gauged by the instrument panel. And yet I am loath to take my eyes for an instant from my periscope or visor. Cut off from visible contact with the outside world, the wireless operator cannot possibly know in which direction the vehicle is moving.
The tanks were not designed with the crew's comfort in mind either. One tanker described the difficulties of devising a sleeping arrangement for his crew.
We had a rotation plan in our tank. The engine compartment stayed hot almost all night. We used to take turns, one night apiece, sleeping on the engine compartment. You can just imagine, you get cold in that goddamn piece of steel. And those tanks were cold.
Sanitary conditions in a tank were also far from ideal.
Right in front of the assistant driver, there was a 4-inch steel pipe with a cap on it. You ate enough cheese that you didn't have any problem about that, but you might have to pee. You would piss in a brass shell casing, hand it over to the loader, and he'd drop them out. That was the sanitation.
In the European theater, another unsettling fact of life was quickly brought to the attention of the Sherman crews. Their vehicles were no match for the enemy's tanks. It was a lesson that was paid for in blood.
Our German gunners see our tanks coming, and they say to each other, "Here comes another Ronson. Why do the Americans do this for us?" Bang! And it burns like 20 haystacks. All the people inside, my God. Those funny tanks with the little guns, and so high and straight we can see them from a long way in our gun sights. Those square sides and